Thank you very much. The first talk I ever gave about about our beloved industry and about book culture, past, present, and speculatively future, was at BookNet Canada 4 years ago. I had forgotten to take my beta blockers. I have this strange, benign heart condition where my resting heart rate is 110 to 120 beats a minute. I survived that. So it was an opportunity that BookNet Canada gave me to effectively give a sequel to that talk. That talk, the topic of that particular conference was calculated risk. And basically my talk was an argument that the greatest risk was to do nothing. That doing anything was better than doing nothing. Partially because I believed that book culture was tremendously resilient. And I think part of what I'm going to try to do today is build on that foundation, build on that awareness of the resilience of the way that books operate within our culture. Try to synthesize some of the stuff that we've heard so far today. Ironically, I discussed a Clive Thompson article in my 2010 talk, an article about the Netflix Mathematics Prize. So there's a certain level of continuity that I'm hoping to draw on, both in terms of recent history. It wants me to join the internet. So in your programs, my talk is called Roi et Mort, Rex Mortus Est. I changed my mind. Not that the king is no longer dead, and not that the next king won't live forever. But I wanted to explore a little bit more, or I wanted to hint more specifically at where I think the opportunities lie. What shape does the new living king take? And in fact, I changed the name of my talk twice. First it was Editors Beat Robots. And I sort of misspoke last night when I was describing my thoughts about changing my talk, and I said editors eat robots. And then I realized that's much better. And I'll explain why shortly. The history of publishing obviously is predated by the history of writing and the history of reading. And I think one of the key things to understand about our present time is that we are now operating at the end of the Industrial Revolution. And that may be, in fact, a highly specific configuration to which we've become accustomed. But to understand some of the aspects of post-industrial book culture, we have to look at pre-industrial book culture, the monks. And one of the key things about writing 1.0, if I may use that nomenclature, is that it was the one time in human history when every writer was guaranteed a living. We tend to think of the printing press as being spectacular for the writer, right? It enabled publishing. But the reality was, economically, it was a disaster because writers were reproducers of text. And along came the printing press, and it put all the, as one historian put it, trained scribal laborers out of a job. And it shifted us into a whole new era of human endeavor. The printing press was effectively the first moment in human history when we were capable of mass reproducing culture. In fact, if you exclude weapons, it was the first moment in human history when we mass reproduced anything. Everything was manual. Cloth, food, shelter, the key things that human beings needed were produced very slowly and very artisanally. And the printing press, other than the ability to use forges to make knives and swords, was the first time humans could churn out copies of anything. So effectively, the Industrial Revolution begins with Gutenberg. And it begins both at the level of, yes, this is the first instance when we can mass reproduce anything, but it also contained within it the seeds of further dynamic development. Once we could do that, information about how to mass reproduce other things spread. Until we got to the point where, in the 19th century, we have a universe where almost everything is mass-produced, and we have a vast shift in the labor force from agriculture to manufacturing, from the country to the city, begetting things like the Toronto Public Library, as our society had to invent new forms of civic formation. How do we make citizens? We make citizens by making books available so that our citizens understand what it is to be a citizen. So that process, which Clive outlined earlier this morning, of a process of literacy, which is consumption-based, right? We are going to read. We're not going to write yet, but we are going to learn how to read. God damn it. So this is just going to be something that I'm going to have to deal with clearly every 5 minutes. Turn the Wi-Fi off. Now, why didn't I think of that? Good move. Bingo. This period of tremendous growth in literacy brought with it several other key innovations. If we are going to have a mass reproduction of things, and if we are going to have tools for making citizens out of laborers, we also need to have tools for selling them things. And here again, the book industry was in the forefront of innovation. The bookshop was the first retail location that permitted the consumer to view and inspect the product before they bought it. All retail prior to that consisted of walking up to a counter, asking for a pound of sugar, a dozen eggs, and a bunch of flour, and somebody went into a back room, came out, plunked it on the table in plain brown paper wrapping, and off you went. The book industry was the first entity in Western capitalism that actually allowed consumers to browse the product, to touch the product, to be turned on by the product's packaging, right, by the cover, to peer inside and look at the frontispiece and think, here is the writer before me. Another area of innovation, therefore, became, so how do we combine manufacturing and retailing? And here we have Alan Lane, the iconic creator of Penguin and his Penguincubator. Now, the interesting thing, it's quite charming to look at this sort of dated picture. This is the world's first vending machine. What did the world's first vending machine vend? It vended books. Now, interestingly, Alan Lane is now viewed as a hero for driving even greater levels of literacy by lowering the price of books to the price of a packet of cigarettes. However, he had relatively little interest in books as such. He was interested in the larger configurations that book created, but he was famous for never actually having read a damn book. Now, does this remind us of anybody? Here's the man that we all love to hate. But Jeff Bezos is effectively doing nothing more than than continuing the trajectory of publishing, a trajectory that was aimed at the broadest possible distribution, at the lowest possible price, with the maximum level of convenience. So if we believe he is the enemy, then we have seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. So how do we transcend us? And I would argue that the way we transcend ourselves is about surpassing our greatest achievement, or our sort of allowing our greatest achievement to be something in whose glory we bask and then move on. And the glory in which we bask is that we effectively solved the supply side problem of culture. We have reached the point where there is a one-to-one relationship between writer and reader. I know this is something that is a source of some anxiety. And I think Clive was trying to explore some of the ways in which we could reconceptualize our anxiety as opportunity as opposed to challenge, to allow all these writers that are coming into our world to be something that we can leverage rather than be crushed by. And to understand how I think we can accomplish this, I want to engage in a little thought experiment, which is to speculate on what would be the list price of a book called Lorem Ipsum. And from the chuckling, I more or less speculate that everybody here knows what Lorem Ipsum is. It's bastardized Latin that is used in many different design programs for illustrating how a text would look if it had a particular design treatment. So if we, as an industry, if any given publisher were to publish a print edition of Lorem Ipsum, what would be what would we have to do? Well, we'd have to design a cover, so we'd have to pay the cover designer. We would have to deal with retailers telling us that it wasn't a good enough cover and going back and designing new covers and paying sales reps to have elaborate conversations with national accounts buyers about what the cover looks like. We will need to proofread it. We won't need to copy edit it, but we do need to proofread it because when you design it, you're going to introduce orphans and widows and things like that. So you need to pay to design the interior, you need to pay to have it proofread, you need to pay for the cover and all the iterations of the cover. You need to catalog it, so you need to write copy describing Lorem Ipsum. That needs to get, shepherded amongst all the different people that get involved in that particular process. You then need, of course, to print the damn thing. And we all know what's involved in doing that, and ship it and go through all the manufacturing, haulage, the boxing, the removing from cartons, the placing on bookshelves, the waiting 6 weeks to find out how many copies of Lorem Ipsum we managed to hoodwink the public into buying, and then wait for the public to not buy 40% of them, as they do even when it's not Lorem Ipsum, put that back in boxes and ship those back to a warehouse and turn it all back into wood pulp. So you'd be hard-pressed to sell it for less than $10.95. Which means, what is the value that we capture above and beyond the process of manufacturing and distribution? It's awfully bloody small. It may very well be that the way to capture the value of a story is something that we've actually struggled to do by using the book form in which to accomplish it. Like democracy, up until recently, it may be the worst of all possible ways other than the alternative. But of course, we had no alternative. If you look at the manufacturing and distribution cost of a pair of sneakers that Nike sells, or pills that come from Pfizer, you realize that the markup that they are able to place in exchange for all their marketing, in exchange for all their IP, is many, 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 many orders of magnitude greater than what the markup that we've been able to charge over the manufacturing and distribution costs of a bunch of letters placed in some random order. So where can we look to for alternatives? 4 years ago, when I threw up a big picture, big face, it was Oprah. And that was because I was trying to explain, much as Clive was today, how books are social glue, right? They are the ties that bind us. They are these things that we use to tell stories about ourselves, about love, shame, guilt, family, infidelity, all those powerful emotions and narratives that animate us as a species. And today I'm going to pander in a different way and go highbrow and suggest that Borges shows us a path forward. Because it has been the case that always that books are not units of something, but that books are axes of relationships. And Borges's vision of the world as a library of innumerable texts, all referring to one another, of course, is a vision that has now come to life. So what are the ways, from a more practical standpoint, in which we can understand that? And one of the ways in which I think it is critical to understand that is to think not in terms of what a book is, but what a book lets us do. If any of us in any of our home countries goes to look at the history of awards, right? If you go to those Giller and GG shortlists from the 1950s and 1960s, or if in the United States one does that for the National Book Award, or if we look at our great global prize, the Nobel, we all realize that there are a shitload of bad choices, right? There's a shitload of stuff we do not take seriously anymore. Conversely, there are all kinds of books that we take tremendously seriously right now, whether it's Kafka or Herman Melville, that were ignored in their lifetime. So clearly, the short-term ways in which we select books for approbation doesn't necessarily turn out to have legs. So what is it then that we're doing by picking? What we're doing by picking is having a conversation. A conversation about what art is culture. And so culture, I feel, is the place in which we can situate ourselves now that we're done creating all the possible tools that we could ever need to create things. How do we build an economy, build a business around the interrelationships amongst them? Framed another way, how do we shift from being the red line, which is my lorem ipsum example illustrated? The book business has fundamentally been a manufacturing business. Most of the value that was got sucked up by the process of manufacturing and distributing things. And we can see in our society where the business of manufacturing and distributing things is going. It's going along the red line. Whereas the blue line, notwithstanding the hiccup of 2009, and as you can see, the hiccup of 2009 affected manufacturing just as much as it affected services, How do we re-understand the publishing business not as a manufacturing business, but as a service business? And in this regard, what I believe we start to see is the ways in which it is not necessarily technology that is the critical thing that we have to change about what we do, because as we've all noticed, we're changing that. You know, it's not as if the question of how we should be doing ebooks is one up for contest anymore. And as we all know from looking at everything from, you know, the takedown of Facebook and Twitter and of social media that Baldur embarked on, or the takedown that any of us could do around Netflix. I mean, not Netflix, but Amazon's people who also bought things, including advice on carpentry books because you bought that for your grandfather last year, that the machine-driven approaches to demand generation, to synthesizing or summarizing culture are on their own currently woefully inadequate. So what is it that algorithms need from us so that they don't break the china of our books? And I realized about 2 months ago, not even 2 months ago, but 6 weeks ago, I was reading The Economist magazine. And The Economist magazine was doing a special section on the future of work. And it was basically trying to understand what jobs are going to get replaced by robots. And so it cited one very large and ambitious academic study by economists on the susceptibility of jobs to computerization, right? What jobs are going to get replaced by robots? And as you can see, there's certain areas of activities, accountants and telemarketers in particular, who are in deep trouble. And as anybody who has experienced either category can imagine, it would be hard anyway to think that robots couldn't do a better job of interacting with us than they do. And at the very top, we have the recreational therapist. What, might you ask, is a recreational therapist? And it turns out to be sort of a cross between a personal trainer and a shrink. But, you know, since I threw this slide up about 1 minute and 30 seconds ago, and given the nature of the people here in this room, I'm sure that by now you have noticed where editor falls. And it turns out that editors are in awfully good shape. It makes it rather ironic that as publishers downsized over the course of the 2000s, over the course of the aughts, or whatever it is we're choosing to call that decade, that they were letting the editors go rather quickly, because as it turns out, the editors are where the greatest value is. Although as I've suggested earlier, the power of the editor may not necessarily lie in some narrow role of sifting through manuscripts and saying, aha, my spectacular literary taste tells me that this is going to be the genius project that we all thought it was going to be. But I think many of us kind of already know that. So what is it, therefore, that I think editors can do? And when I wrote this slide over the last couple of days, as I sort of suggested when I was launching into this particular talk, it may not be, in fact, that editors break robots, right, or even beat robots. But if editors can eat robots, how does that help? What does that look like? And I think part of it is suggested in something that, again, Clive already hinted at earlier today, which is not only is there a one-to-one relationship between the number of people writing and the number of people reading today, but in fact, writer and reader are not individuals. Right? They're activities. They are things we are all already doing. We write to read, we read to write. It is a circular and ideally virtuous activity. So another way of framing this in a more sort of classically tech conference slide kind of fashion, and I'm not a big user of tech conference slides, so I actually stole this from a Marco Ferrario, an Italian friend of mine who runs the sort of independent digital book distributor, Book Republic in Italy. This was something Marco sent me a couple of days ago to basically try to synthesize and frame his understanding of the vast array of startups and legacy content companies out there in the world. And effectively, what he was trying to understand was who's encroaching on one another's territory, right? So we used to have an industry where we had very, very defined roles along our value chain from writer to reader. But if writer and reader are not in fact people, but activities inhabited in a single individual, then how do businesses try to situate themselves in the writing-reading economy? And so you have companies at the top, basically, at the platform level, you have companies that focused fundamentally on the supply side. Smashwords, Kindle Direct Publishing, Facebook, YouTube, Wattpad, and so on and so forth. Places that offered you tools to write. Now, obviously, at the same side, a number of those companies I mentioned also offer you places to read. But then how do we understand other entities that fall within there, whether it's TED or Penguin or Random House or my company, Byliner? Now, I'm going to start to try to answer that question from a relatively publisher-centric standpoint with charts. This particular chart, the demand curve, is a fairly basic microeconomic one. It basically suggests that for any given product, for any given relationship, I would hasten to specify, for any given relationship, there are varying levels of demand. So there may be 10,000 people who want to have a $1 relationship with a writer, and one person who wants to have a $10,000 relationship with that writer. Now, we're somewhat familiar with the $1 version, right? That's the super cheap promotional discount or by a traditional publisher or more of a standard price point around a self-published one. And we're more or less familiar with $9.99, right? That's what we charge for digital books, broadly speaking, and $14 for a paperback. It's a little higher in Canada, I know. So what about the numbers above? And 40 to 450, or in fact much higher, is the world of limited editions, about which I'm going to speak in a sec. And then above that we have the MFA writing programs, a zone where we're not talking, as you know, about $400. We're talking about people spending $50,000 to engage with a writer. So we're talking about a very, 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 very expansive demand curve. And we're talking about an industry that has only chosen to inhabit a couple of middling rectangles of that for most of our existence. So how do we find a way to capture all the value under the demand curve? And that's by understanding that we are not in the business of making things, but in the business of conducting relationships. And so that there is no reason why publishers can't run creative writing programs. Faber in the UK has been doing it for 2 years and generated over £1 million in revenue last year from their creative writing programs. If in the case of limited editions, my particular version of the demand curve there was a fairly traditional one, but there's another demand curve called the Veblen curve. which basically suggests that at a certain point, the more expensive a good becomes, the more people want it. That's the theory of conspicuous consumption. Again, our particular industry, while it was brilliant a couple of hundred years ago at realizing that if you let consumers see the good before they buy it, they might want to buy more of it. But we have subsequently done a shitty job of understanding the complexity of pricing. So when we walk into a fashion store, we see the $8,000 Prada ball gown. Now, why is the $8,000 Prada ball gown in that store? It's not in there to get bought. It's in there to make the $250 blouse look like a deal. And why are the $25 or $45 cufflinks in there? It's to have something that is cheaper and sort of that you don't want to buy because you don't have to buy the cheap thing from the store. You want to have to buy the more medium price thing from the store. We are so suggestible around pricing, in fact, that some of the economists, the behavioral economists, who've been studying this closely over the last 20, 30, 40 years, particularly curious about the problem of how people price stocks and equities and bonds. But they've started to look at more narrow consumer behavior, and they asked basically a group of people to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number. I can't remember what the Canadian equivalent is, but I know you have one, right? So write down the last 2 digits of the social security number, and then you effectively engage in a game of guess the price of the thing. And the lower the last 2 digits of your social security number were, the more you thought things cost. No, sorry, the other way around. The less you thought things cost. We're that suggestible that when we have to guess a price for something, the fact that we thought of a lower number a minute or 2 ago makes us think that it is worth less. So basically, we have no fucking clue what anything is worth. So for us as an industry to be sort of running around trying to say, how do we persuade people that things are worth what all the effort we put into them is not going to work. But there are other ways that we can think about it. You know, Steve Jobs or Miuccia Prada is not running around launching campaigns to persuade people that their things are worth more. You just feel it when you see it. And so the opportunity to use all the print legacy that we have, all the knowledge that we have about making things is something that we can use, but it is critical to think about it not in terms of some cost-plus pricing structure, but in terms of a service, right? How can I make somebody feel like a snob? How can I make somebody feel good? And if you don't like snob as a word, there are many, many other words that we all use in our day-to-day lives to try to capture the cultural value that we do. So now I get onto those slides. I had promised BookNet that this would be a talk I had never given before, which meant that as you get toward the end, you realize that you just have to start delivering information rather than spending all your time doing Google image search. And so now I get to the point, and you know who you are, Michael Tamblyn. Now I get to the point of the boring bullet points. So I've already effectively, and when I'm talking about unbundled, well, I'll get to that in a sec. So when we reconceive of publishing and book culture as a service, right, as opposed to a manufacturing industry, so I've already gone through sort of like one pathway of understanding that, which is what are all the different ways in which we can productize the relationship between a person engaged in the act of writing and a person engaged in the act of reading. Inhabiting all those things under the demand curve and exploring all the pricing that you can do with it. But what are some of the other ways? And I'm particularly interested in the question of editor. And I don't necessarily mean that in the narrow sense of the acquisitions editor, but all those capacities that have lived inside literary magazines, book publishers, journals, inside independent bookstores, inside the smarter employees of the chains, and so on and so forth, under the rubric of editorial. And so one of them is something that we've, in ad hoc ways, different publishers to different degrees have been doing for quite a while, right? When I gave my talk 4 years ago at BNC, at the end of it, there was Q&A, and one question came up, and the questioner said, "Are you talking about marketing or publishing?" And I was like, holy fuck, I totally didn't get my ideas across at all, did I? But then, as I sort of stood there in sort of paralyzed silence for 2, 3, 4 seconds, I began to realize that I was probably misunderstanding the question, or at least that the question crystallized something for me, which is that publishing for people who are not publishers is marketing. That the entirety of Western capitalism has realized they can no longer engage in push marketing and shoving ads in the 2 television stations that are, and just making us pound the color of the Coke can into our brains until we just drink Coke. All right, they have realized that brands are not stories. Brands are stories other people are telling about you. And so they've embraced the world of content marketing. And what is content marketing? Content marketing is telling stories about what you do, about why you do it. And that all the talents that reside inside publishing entities that are designed to help people crystallize their stories can be done on behalf of entities other than individuals on whom you're placing a venture capital style bet that when you do this, you will collectively come up with a product that is going to sell large numbers of units. I'm not saying that you can't still try to do that, but I am suggesting that there is a tremendous revenue opportunity around the ability to charge companies large amounts of money to help them tell their stories. I mean, McSweeney's produced the Converse Annual for a large sum of money that I am not permitted to disclose. And they suggested that they print 3,000 copies of it, and they then printed 3,000 copies of it, all at Converse's expense, and then Converse said we only needed 1,000 copies. So it barely even mattered how many copies of this thing that they created. What they were doing is that they were helping Converse tell a story. And lest that feel a little tawdry to you, the reality is that all those magazines and newspapers that the book industry have relied upon for decades to produce book reviews and to run first serial excerpts were being funded by Converse and their ilk anyway. Because those entities are going into the custom publishing business, and those entities are getting unbundled and trying to shift from manufacturing to services, just like we all have to / are about to. One could, however, choose not to do that in a bundled way, right? Not to just sort of say to a particular company, right, we are going to tell your story in the form of a book. You can just sort of say, we will design your cover, right? I think one of the huge errors around the ways in which book publishers have interfaced with self-publishing is they just bought a self-publisher, right? Penguin bought Author Solutions. Terrible idea. Author Solutions is completely commoditized. They are dealing with Smashwords that charge less money, and Smashwords is dealing with BookBaby that basically is now giving it away. These are commodity businesses, the ability to just sort of like stick a Microsoft Word file and make a EPUB out of it. But would somebody pay $2,000 for Rodrigo Corral, the great art director of books at the publisher, and I'm now cannot remember which one it is. Is it FSG? Anyway, in the U.S., the desire for a quality product, right? The desire to own the thing at the Veblen curve at the top need not just be at the level of the fancy limited edition. It can also be at the level of, I want Don DeLillo's cover designer, and I will pay $10,000 for Don DeLillo's cover designer. So we have inside all those services that I was describing that we use to try to sell lorem ipsum for $10.95 can also be used at a much higher revenue generating standpoint when you're not placing bets on the book, but that you are engaged in a fee for service kind of business. And all those editors that got laid off from publishers over the course of 2003 to 2009 are out there doing that right now anyway. So why should we have to wait for them? Why should you have to wait to fire them for them to start generating fee-based revenue off what they're doing, as opposed to placing a bet at the racetrack style modes of generating value from their cultural insights? And then the last one I'm going to point to is a little more complex, but I hope gets at some of the questions and some of the conversation that went on after Clive's talk and around the conversation that Ashley and Dominique were having, which is that we all look at the world, all of that, the 36 million books worth of text that we're producing every day, and saying, oh my God, I am overwhelmed by all this crap. Which is no different than what editors used to say about the slush pile. We should stop waiting around for someone else to solve the filter problem and should start being the filter problem. There are algorithms right now that are engaging in a high speed but very crude real-time semantic search, looking for tweets that complain about how Air Canada lost my baggage, looking for tweets about United Airlines shitty customer service, looking to find out what bleaches people are using. The Twitter and Facebook fire hoses are being mined at great expense by real-time entity extraction engines. Ironically, one of the entity extraction engines we were using to mine literature when I was at Small Demons. We repurposed Alitalia Lost My Baggage to find all the Smiths songs in Nick Hornby novels. But the reality is that that data is messy, it's kludgy, it is very atomized. But there are stories in there. We can help find the stories. We are supposed to have been finding diamonds in the rough and going panning for gold the entire history of book culture. And there is no reason why we cannot be doing that with the other flows of text that our society is generating by eating the robots, right? By taking all those entity extraction algorithms and using them to help find the actual stories, to help build the actual stories. The last thing I want to address is a sort of a flip side of that particular process, which is to look at the reading side of the process. And that is where I get my sort of payoff, where I get to talk about what I'm personally doing, which is to try to understand what services mean, not at the level of creating and filtering, but at the level of making it easy as possible to create. And so the company I'm now at, Byliner, is a company that through a variety of ways, both commissioning early on and now via licensing from publishers, has collected 30,000 stories, short fiction and narrative nonfiction, and has an app that allows you to read them. Now, the reality is that we have that already, right? It's called the library. As is always pointed out in the comments section of any of those sort of like breathless articles that have been written about Oyster and about Scribd and so on and so forth. What is the service? So the service is not, we have all the books. All the books are out there. They are on BitTorrent sites. They are in the libraries. There is, as we know, more content produced than we could ever possibly read if we were a bazillion monkeys typing at typewriters and then reading the stuff that we were typing at typewriters. So one of the things that we were doing, and I thought that a bunch of the things that were being done by that cool named app, which I'm forgetting, but the dude is from Malta, is to simply say, if you're in an iPhone app, what is your problem? Your problem is you have a certain amount of time. So what is the number one thing that you need to be able to do to start filtering what you want to read? It's how much time do I have before my flight takes off? How much time do I have before I have to pick my kid up from daycare? And so one of the key things that we have done with our app is to simply say, ask the reader, how much time do I have? On our iPad app, we simply ask, what mood are you in to go along with what time you have? And these are the kinds of questions that we have to also be asking ourselves from the huge aggregators who are we going to work with. What are the problems that they are solving for people when they are in reading mode? And the last thing I'm going to suggest is that the next level beyond asking questions around time and asking questions around mood is this, the jawbone, which is, and there are several people, including the next speaker, who wears one. Ask Robert from Random House Canada about his jawbone. What these are about is trying to overcome a problem that we have around exercise, where we know it will help us in 10 years, but right now we don't want to walk to the subway, we want to take a taxi cab. How do we get more exercise in our lives? And so the great challenge for reading services is going to be the same. How do we start reimagining reading as a service so that we can start to think about the ways in which people can put more reading in their lives, just as people are now asking about how they can put more exercise in their lives. So this is me. Anytime I ever agree to talk, I always say at the end, I am an open book to you. So feel free to email me any thoughts, questions, harangues. Feel free to check out Byliner. That code, free3, will give you 3 free months of 30,000 stories, whether you have 5 minutes or 105. So thank you very, very much indeed.